Greetings. I wanted to go over the mapping practicum requirements set of slides. So first off, what would the big picture look like for a 5-year plan to finish our doctoral program if you were coming in with a prior master's? So a lot of times if people have done, for example, a KCREP master's, you may have about 300 hours that you did on your practicum internship for that degree. And we want you aiming for about 500 hours as a minimum, because that's a minimum of many of the internships through APIC. So people with a prior master's are really going to have no difficulty getting to those kinds of minimums. So the first year, we have you really focusing on getting off to a good start on your pre-dissertation, getting grounded relationally, kind of getting a sense of the department, the program, other students, faculty. An ambitious goal would be to shoot for something like 50 hours of outreach. So if you broke that up over a year, it'd be about 1 hour per week. If you kind of look at the fall, spring semesters, it might be about 2 hours per week, and then you take the summer off. So in year 2, we're looking for everyone to do a training at a practicum site like a university counseling center. So like Kennesaw University might be an example. Georgia Tech usually wants advanced students, but if someone had a prior master's, that might be a really good option. So these are places that we have long-standing relationships with. We know they're focused on training. And we know that people will get plenty of hours and so have a strong base to some of the things that you might want later on. Then in year 3, we begin to really start to contextualize some of your choices for practicum to the kinds of sites that you might want to apply to for internship. So one example is if you know that you want to apply to VA hospitals, then at some point they're going to probably want you to have worked at the Atlanta VA if you can. And then also they value assessments and experience with some of the empirically supported manuals that they use, particularly for treating trauma. And so having experience in some of those areas, it's going to make you more competitive. So you'll start to align your experience with the things that they want. And then in year 4, one of the things that you could begin thinking about is if it's the case that it would be ideal to have finished your dissertation before you start internship so you can really focus your time, then year 4 is a key year for getting that work done. And one of the ways that would free up some of your time to focus on dissertation is aligning your site that year with some of your other goals for the year. So you can kind of see year 1 is a little bit light. Year 2 and 3 are heavy years. You could be doing something like 10 hours a week in direct service, possibly, maybe higher, but somewhere in that ballpark. And then year 4 is a good time to do something that might have a little more flexibility. So in the fall, you might continue to do more hours, but then you might soften your load a little bit in the spring so you can focus on your dissertation. So that's just kind of a big picture overview. So we created a Google form just to keep everybody on the same page because we've got a number of people supporting you during your first year. And this may change a little bit, but the bottom line is this Google form is our roadmap. And so if there are changes, those changes will be communicated on this form. And we want you to use this form to kind of document any things that are happening, anything that you need. And it makes sure that everyone who needs to know that information is kind of seeing the same thing. So for example, we have you do some preliminary work to talk with your doctoral advisor and start to sketch out a possible plan. And then this year on October 27th, the Counseling Psych Seminar on Friday will focus on practicum planning. And you'll have a chance to meet with Dr. Turner, Dr. Davis, and some of the other students of the second and third years And you can, talk about some of the sites that they're currently at, share your ideas of your tentative plan and get feedback from the group, whatever we want to do. So that time is dedicated to mapping out a big picture plan. And then by December 1st, we want you to send us a rank list of your potential sites. So it would be ideal if you send us 3. And then I'm not sure if this will be necessary because we're doing the meeting in October. But if you're going to have one-on-one meetings with Dr. Turner, those would happen by January 15th. And then by January 20th, we want you to have prepared your cover letters. And so, by then she would have told you, really by early January, she would have told you the 3 sites that she wants you to apply to. And so you'll begin to draft those materials. You'll get feedback from Aaron and Sally and I. And when, we feel like those are in a good place, we'll say, Dr. Turner, these are ready. Are they good to go? And Dr. Turner will give you the thumbs up and give you specific directions on how to apply. So the key thing here is Dr. Turner is the one who coordinates with however people want this to work. And there are different processes. So some places, maybe at one end of the spectrum, it is almost like applying for a job, and they're interviewing master students, doc students. They have, like Kennesaw might be a good example. They have a number of positions that they're trying to fill, and we are just competing amongst everybody else, and we don't have any particular advantage except they like our students, and we've done a good job in the past. But they're not going to take our word for it. We can't just vouch for somebody and say, this person's ready, and then they'll take the person. They're going to interview, and they have their own process. And so in a certain way, this matches what will happen with APIC in many ways. There's more say on the site side of who they want to select, and we're kind of at the mercy of their decision-making process. On the other hand, some of our sites, particularly some of our newer sites, we have cultivated relationships, and there's less of a interview process, and it's more Dr. Turner is talking closely with the training director or whoever is the point of contact at the site. And they may not really have as many positions, but they, in an extreme form, they may have one position, and it may be up to the program to kind of do a process and decide, well, what's going to be the best fit? And, and we can consider various things, but it may be more Dr. Turner's decision in coordination with Aaron and I. So because this varies, she's going to just give you specific directions of what she wants you to do, and that is what you will do. So you'll apply to all your sites by February 1st, and then from there, it's a little bit of a waiting game. Part of the reason why we have this course is just to offer a place to process and support, and if there's anything that needs to be done, we can kind of deal with it in the moment. So we're just kind of going week to week at that point. So some of you may get an offer right away, but it might not be at your top ranked place, and so we can kind of support you to figure out the best way to handle that. Do you want to, kind of ask for time to look at all your options, or this is somewhat similar to when you're on the job market. There may be situations where you have to decide on one thing before you know all of your other options. And so we can kind of help you sort that out depending on what your situation is. But most of that is usually sorted through by, I kind of made up this date, but March 15th. So it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for everything to kind of settle. So we kind of prep you way in advance. I mean, this is, almost 6 months ahead of this time. just so you can even now begin to prepare for some of the ambiguity of that period. There are a few things like this in between now and you getting settled into a first job, and it can be stressful to not know exactly what's going to happen and to kind of wish that you had more control of the process. And we, honestly, we do too. We wish we could just pick your first choice and you all got your first choice. But that isn't how this process works. And so one of the things that we're doing in this course is providing some support and structure to kind of keep you in a lane where you can wait well, kind of sit with the tension and ambiguity without kind of getting into some of the mental spaces where anxiety can heat up in a certain kind of way. And so we'll probably spend some time talking about that ahead of time. We can kind of ask each other, how would we know if things were kind of going into a place that's less helpful? So y'all are kind of already figuring out, I like analogies. So the thing that comes to mind here is like the middle of the road. If you're driving, let's call that a mood space that's kind of like the green zone. So you're generally content, feeling positive emotion, somewhat low energy, or, actually it'd be okay to be in some yellow, like really excited, looking forward to practicum. But I mean, we really do want you to feel okay about this process. And so, the blue zone, feeling sad, grief, disappointment, we're hoping to mitigate some of those feelings. Even though you may not get exactly what you want, we think it's very possible to kind of stay in a space where big picture, you're on track to meet all of your training goals, because this is a broader process. Or how is it that we would stay out of, kind of that red zone that we talked about earlier? So higher energy, negative emotion like fear or anger or irritability. So the reality is, that's not our wish for you. You may end up having some of those feelings, but our wish for the general kind of more stable resting point would be that we're more in the green or the yellow. And so we will do what we can to make that possible, if that's a goal of yours as well. So you'll end up having lots of times to talk with Dr. Turner about this as you get further along, but I wanted to give you just a little roadmap of what you might be shooting for with hours. And so this slide does illustrate, if you have a prior master's, things just get kind of easy to hit some of the minimums. So if you end up starting with 300, after your first year, if you got something like 50, you'd be at 350 total. In your second year, if you went somewhere like Kennesaw State or Georgia Tech, you'd likely get at least 150 direct hours, and you'd already be sitting pretty close to 500. And then if you had another year like that, you'd be at 650, way over the minimums. And then, your fourth year, you actually could scale it back and you'd still be at 700 hours. And if you look at some of the APIC materials, that is above and beyond. There's a point of diminishing marginal return. So you might decide to continue to get more hours and experience, and that would be good for your training. But in terms of you having access to opportunities, and, having a good shot at getting your first or second choice for your placement, it probably has less influence, and it starts to shift to some other things: specialized experience, what kind of letters you have, other things would be more important than just raw hours. The big picture, if you don't have a prior master's, the main difference is in your first year, in our orientation and practicum course, we're going to end up making sure you have coverage of some of the content that would otherwise be prerequisite courses. So instead of having you sit in, people who did a K-Cert master's would end up with like 60 hours of course time. We're not going to have you do 60 hours, but we are going to make sure that we cover some of the key areas. And so The two big areas is we're going to do some of the activities that would go in like a helping skills course in the fall, and then in the spring we're going to do some work related to theory and kind of a practical application of theory. So how does your theory affect what you do during the intake process, especially conceptualization and treatment planning? We also make sure you have some training in dealing with crisis, and we start to kind of have you think about what some of the procedures are. For example, assessing suicide risk. What are some of the likely procedures that might exist at your first practicum placement? And by March, we'll have a pretty good sense of where you are. We'll know where you're going, and we can start to kind of prepare you for that specific site. This slide illustrates that if you are trying to finish in 5 years and you don't have a prior master's, the minimum goal of hitting 500 starts to get a little bit tighter. And so, one way to kind of relax that would be you could look at sites that are less rigid about that 500 minimum. And there are a number of sites. And so, for example, one of the guys that I went to school with, Joshua Hook, he didn't have a prior master's. And I think he ended up with something like 300 hours, but he had a strong CV, really strong sites and experience. And so he got a lot of interviews. He did fine. And this was back in the day. I feel kind of like one of those people that says it was uphill both ways in the snow. But right now they don't have as much of a shortage with sites. But when PsyD programs were kind of at their zenith, there was a real shortage of sites, and it was something like 25% of people didn't match on their first try, or I guess each time through. And so we were kind of staring at a 25% chance that we might be taking another year, even though we didn't want to. So that's not where things are now. But even within that context, Josh did okay. So that's one way to relax it. We don't necessarily recommend that line of thought. We recommend that you aim for 500. And so if you do that, 50 would be actually a pretty good goal for your first year. Let's go ahead and get you off to a good start. And then if you ended up with 150 to 200 1 year, let's say your second year you did 150, your third year you do 200. Now you're within striking distance of 500, especially if you ended up picking up something like an assessment practicum over the summer. Then it would be pretty easy to see how you would get above that 500-hour threshold. Just to kind of get this process going, one of the things we want you to do is complete a 2-pager with a plan for completing practicum requirements at Georgia State. We want you to kind of account for some of the things that we've talked about today, other things that we talk about in the course, and give a sense of your ideal practicum sequence that you'd like to pursue. If, selection processes aside, if that was no issue and you could just pick anything you wanted, what would the sequence be? And then we're going to start to do some contingency planning, and your advisor can help with that. So how likely is it that you'll be able to kind of sequence the things perfectly aligned with your, kind of perfect world? And what would happen if, so let's say you put on there that you want to go to the VA in your first year. Well, that's pretty unlikely. And so we may have to start to negotiate your plan, but it would be very possible that you would have a chance to go to the VA hospital in one of the years. Or let's say you wanted to go to Grady Hospital in your first year. Well, that actually might not be a good plan, because the level of severity of some of the symptoms you would be seeing make that possibly not an ideal placement depending on your prior experience. And then the other concern that we might have is the consistency of hours at that site may not be perfect. And so it might actually make a better placement as you're getting towards the end of your training, especially if you have a prior master's, because getting hours is less of a concern and getting more specialized experience becomes more valuable to giving you good options for internship. So just to kind of keep everyone on the same page, all of this will kind of be using a Teams page to do, and that will give your advisor the ability to look at some of the work you're doing in this area. It'll give Dr. Turner, Aaron, Sally, all of us can kind of look at that at the same time. And so we'll make use of some of those tools to coordinate the work and the feedback process. So the last thing that I will say is we're starting to create an appendix where students who are currently placed at some of these practicum sites are helping us make a slide for each site. And so I kind of got this started. I pulled a few screenshots from Georgia Tech's counseling center. You'll notice we've got some of our students either in postdoc roles or practicum roles, which is exciting. And then within the notes section on the slide deck, you'll see additional information that people thought might be helpful as you're considering that site. What we're going to do is every year when we have our annual survey at the end of the year, we're going to add a couple of questions where you'd have an opportunity to say, 1 to 5, how satisfied were you with your site? And then a couple of open-ended questions of what did you like? Any cautions that you might have for other students. And so we'll be able to kind of aggregate those over time to give you some sense of what students have said about the different sites. So thank you. That gives a general overview of how to map out the practicum sequence and some of the things that we'll be doing over the next 6 months to kind of get you ready to start your first doctoral placement. We'll have a chance at orientation to talk about this more, particularly at lunch with Dr. Turner. And then for an hour each week as a group, we'll have a chance to talk together and really deal with any questions that are coming up as you go through your first year. So you have lots of support, lots of relationships to kind of help start to orient to what's expected and get a sense of the opportunities that are available within the greater Atlanta area. And so we're looking forward to talking with you more later on this week.